Hello and welcome to Williams Mullen Trending Now, an IP podcast, a legal podcast focused on providing innovative companies and investors with important and timely information concerning intangible assets such as patents, trademarks, copyrights, and trade secrets. I'm your host, Ed White, and today I'll be joined by my partner, Janet Cho, who is one of my teammates in our intellectual property section here at Williams Mullen. And we're going to discuss tips on online brand monitoring and enforcement. Janet, how are you today?
I'm doing fine, Ed. How about you?
Doing well. I'm excited to discuss this topic today because it's not uncommon for online brand management to be difficult for clients to contemplate. And it, therefore it becomes a bit of a burden that is oftentimes pushed to the back burner, but nevertheless, it's important. Certainly under our trademark law here in the US and in many other jurisdictions, it's incumbent on brand owners to police and enforce their trademark rights. And I feel like this has become especially important in the online realm, given our collective dependence on e-commerce. That's probably no better illustrated than this past year with the shutdowns and quarantines due to the COVID-19 pandemic. E-commerce has really become a necessity, and online brand management and monitoring, therefore, has never become really more critical. So, today we're going to discuss the various harms that brand owners may face and how they can prevent those harms. So let me kick it off with just talking a little bit about sort of two pillars of harm that clients and brand owners should be concerned about online. One really is reputational damage. That's where we're looking at trademark misuse, disparagement, tarnishment, dilution. Certainly those are important things and things that a brand owner wants to avoid. The other pillar I would say is economic harm, where they're concerned about, true economic harm to their bottom line in the form of, how they are losing sales. And oftentimes that comes in the form of counterfeit goods on sites that are being offered in place of the real McCoy. So with that, Janet, it seems to me like in creating an online brand monitoring and enforcement strategy, clients should really consider how to educate their teams and their consumers. So I'd love to get your thoughts on those fronts.
Yeah, so thank you, Ed. I think I agree with you that in this day and age, it's become a necessity to have some sort of online presence, even if you're not necessarily selling goods online, even if you want to share information online, it's important to engage in some education. And I think one thing I'd like to encourage all, businesses that have an online presence is in the rush to be online, to take a step back, maybe take a little bit of a breather and think about how to educate stakeholders, both internal and external, about your brand and how to best protect your brand. So when we talk about education, what do we mean by that? Who are we educating? How and when? So I think the one thing to think about as you continue your online business, or maybe as you're contemplating your online presence, is to establish some guidelines as to, what your brand is, what is protected, what you value. And that can be, written and shared with relevant parties. That could be online, but establishing some sort of standards or guidelines that essentially identify what your brands are, how they should be presented, how and when they should and should not be used. And, one thing that's really helpful, one perhaps easy way to get that across or to share that is, with your employees, with your vendors, with your contractors, all of the people internally that you do business with, is to share that with them because they, to your point, talking about, monitoring and the pillars of protection, those internal stakeholders are going to be a very important part of helping a company or helping a brand monitor any potential misuse. And so in order for them to help with monitoring, I think it's very, very important for them to know what it is they should be looking for. So they should know what it is, what your company's brand is, how it should be used and how it shouldn't be used. And likewise, I think it's important to educate your consumers. So very oftentimes you may go to a website that says, here are our brand standards. And for bigger companies, you'll definitely see that. That's something that as a brand owner you can do, make that information available online, or, make a note on your website to say, if you're interested in our brand guidelines, we can share those with you. And I've also seen clients who make those brand guidelines a part of the contracting that they do with their customers. So very often, if you want to engage in business with a particular company, they want to make sure, a company often wants to make sure that you're going to abide by the brand standards. So I would say making sure that everyone who comes into contact with you internally and externally is aware of what you own and, how you seek to protect that. I'd also say, contingent to that is making sure that you properly mark your brand. So if you have a registered trademark, make sure that you're including the registration symbol when you use it prominently. And also, before that, if you have important assets and brands, you may want to consider registering those. One common consideration is, I own a host of brands. What are the ones that I want to register? And I think that you want to balance your financial investment in your brands with the consideration of what is important to you as a company, what you may be using for the long term. So I'm certainly not making the recommendation that you register everything, but perhaps taking some time to decide which are the brands that are most important to you as a company, and which are the brands that you may be using for the long term. So I think generally education is very, very important, so that everyone is playing on the same, playing with the same rules and can help you as the brand owner enforce your brand. But I would also say, going hand in hand with education is, once you've educated those who are working with you, you probably want to have some system in place to monitor what's actually going on with your brand, right? So if you have people, out there who are knowledgeable about your brand, how do you take it to the next step to see if there's actual misuse? So Ed, I know, this is something you have a lot of experience with, so perhaps maybe you want to discuss some helpful monitoring methods for your brand.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Janet. And it's funny. It's the same theme that you discussed. It's the thoughtful look at what you need when it comes to monitoring. Essentially, when it comes to monitoring methods, it's important to remember that one size does not fit all. In fact, if a brand monitoring strategy is going to work effectively, it really does need to be tailored to the individual brand owner. What are their specific needs? What is their budget? Those are all things that should be contemplated when you create and then implement your monitoring strategy. For example, if you're a brand owner who provides services to clients, you're probably more concerned about reputational damage in the form of false and misleading reviews, or false and misleading posts, or even false and misleading counter and comparative advertising. That's probably most important to you. Whereas if you're a brand owner that sells a high volume of consumer goods, you may be more worried about the threat of counterfeit goods being offered in e-commerce and auction websites. And so therefore, those are the things that are driving your monitoring strategy. It's also important, as I said, to create and implement a monitoring method that's economically feasible and therefore sustainable, because obviously you need to continue to monitor online to get the, essentially the most effective bang for the buck. That's why when we try to help clients design and adopt monitoring methods, we really do look to what is their individual basis and what are their individual needs. So, what are some scalable approaches? What are some examples that clients may use for online brand monitoring? Well, first and foremost, clients should consider in-house resources. And these may include regular web searches for references to the client's brand, including searches of e-commerce sites such as Amazon and Alibaba. Clients can also utilize alert tools that are offered typically for free by most online search engines such as Google Alerts. And those will highlight and identify when their brand is mentioned in media posts, and we'll put it front and center for them each day so that they can review those posts. There are also commercial vendors who will provide services to clients. Clients may wish to commission trademark, domain name, and online services. And these watching services, oftentimes clients are most familiar with them with regard to trademark watches, which are essentially providing them, an alert when a perhaps competitor is trying to file a trademark at the Patent and Trademark Office that is similar to their trademark. But it also works for domain names. It also works for online use of trademarks. And these services can be requested and tailored to bolster your in-house efforts. And they typically we're looking at costs of probably hundreds of dollars each year, depending on the services that you request. And then finally, clients can engage companies that provide online searching and monitoring on a 24/7 basis. Some of these companies will use advanced algorithms, they'll use individual analysts. And so, therefore, they're typically more expensive. But obviously, clients need to weigh the risk reward in obtaining or commissioning these vendor services. If the risk is great in terms of lost sales, then perhaps the reward of having these more expensive services is worthwhile. So those are just a few methods that clients should consider generally. And we could always certainly discuss with clients more specifically what works for them or what should work for them going forward. But Janet, let's talk about, if a client has really completed their monitoring methods and they do find something that is of concern online, it's a potential threat to their brand, what should they do in the enforcement realm?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And I think enforcement tracks very similarly to what you discussed regarding monitoring. Enforcement can come at different costs of time and money, and it really should be tailored to you as a company and what it is you're trying to accomplish through your enforcement efforts. And I would largely describe enforcement maybe as a increasing threshold in terms of time and expense and aggressiveness. So there are if you find out that someone is using, say, your mark online without authorization or is misusing your mark in some way online, then one thing you could do is, one, try and utilize if the use is on another site that has some sort of removal or takedown procedure, is to try and utilize that procedure. And that's something that you can do on your own, or you can do that internally. You may have to spend some time on that website trying to dig out that information, the online complaint procedure. But that's definitely something that I would recommend as an initial first step, is going to that involved website and determining how you can complain or report misuse so that the content can be taken down. You can also go to that site's website terms of use or terms of service to understand, what it is you may need to do to get this to the person within the company, the offending company, so that it can be reviewed and taken down. So I think these things where you actually engage with the website directly, I think are things that I would generally recommend, because they can be done very quickly and pretty simply. And if you designate someone in the company to do this or train them to do this, it can be done. And oftentimes the content will come down. So that's a first step. You can also, if that's not where you necessarily want to start, or maybe you want to take a bit more of an aggressive approach, you can write a cease and desist letter to the other party. If there's a domain name involved, you can also commence what's called a UDRP proceeding. And that's proceeding which is arbitration involving misuse by another party of your mark in a domain name. And one thing I will say is that the UDRP proceedings are used by a lot of our clients, mainly because they're faster than litigation, and they tend to be, not always, but they can be somewhat more cost effective than litigation. The downside, if you are interested in financial damages with UDRPs, is the remedy is the transfer of the domain and not financial damages. So that's one thing to think about. But if you are interested in seeking financial damages or enjoining another party from further using your mark, then one thing you can consider is litigation in federal court. So in terms of enforcement, I would say a brand owner has many different options available to them, from sort of the simple to the more complex. And these are things that can be used in an escalating fashion. Sometimes you can use them perhaps at the same time, depending on what you're trying to do. So there's some flexibility. And then also with goods, one thing you should definitely consider if your product is something that may be susceptible to counterfeiting is using appropriate customs monitoring at the points of embarkation and debarkation for your product. So in that way, you've got an authority helping you with your anti-counterfeiting enforcement efforts. So I think, as with everything that we've talked about today, the most important thing in terms of online brand monitoring is making sure that you have some structures in place to do these things, and then also choosing those procedures or those solutions that work for you. And, what may have worked in the early stages of your company may no longer work now, or something that was very feasible in one dispute may not be as reasonable in another dispute. So I would just encourage all brand owners to be flexible and maintain some fluidity when it comes to monitoring, education, and enforcement. So with that, I think that wraps up our discussion on tips on online brand monitoring and enforcement. And I'd like to thank you, Ed, for joining me on Trending Now and IP Podcast. If you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please contact us. You can also visit our intellectual property practice page at williamsmullen.com/IP. There you can find out more about our team, as well as past episodes of this podcast and legal alerts. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified when our next episode posts. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you the next time.